don't get your question in this afternoon, please don't be too upset. We will pose it to our speakers in sort of written form later on. So look, we've got limited time. We said we will definitely close by 2:30. I know everyone's busy. So I'm going to get on with it and introduce our first speaker, who, in the cliche of these things, but for once it's true, needs very little introduction, Dame Louise Casey, who's chair of the COVID-19 Rough Sleeping Response Task Force. It will take the whole hour and a half if I go through all the positions she's held, but you'll all be familiar with the Casey Review. You'll all be familiar with her work on troubled families. She was director of the Home Office's Antisocial Behaviour Unit. She was head of the Cross-Government Respect Task Force. And from February this year, the Prime Minister appointed her as an advisor to help tackle homelessness with a specialist task force to lead the next phase of the government's support for rough sleepers during the pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Louise so she could tell us a little bit about the task force and its work. And I guess the sort of question that we all are sort of wrestling with, which is, what can we do finally to end the problem of homelessness in the UK? Louise, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody. I can see some people, but very few. I can see Phil, I can see Maxine and Jonathan, but everybody else, you're just blanked out because these are the way these calls are run. So look, first of all, the thing to say is I agreed to do a review, Jonathan's correct, into rough sleeping and the causes of rough sleeping. And I was going to start that after Easter, I think. And then in the meantime, COVID-19 came and is still with us. And very much, I just literally dropped into Whitehall to say, do you want a hand with sort of what's happening around COVID-19, in part because, as some colleagues may know, I actually sort of chair a modest, but it's American, so it has to be global. It's actually a really modest-sized organization of a bit of me and two other people in Chicago called the Institute of Global Homelessness, because it's American, it has to be global. And also it has to sound like it's huge, but actually it's just a bit of me and a bit of some other people. But it does mean that I have some interest in international homelessness and trends. I've gone full circle back to where I started as a volunteer all of those years ago in Centrepoint. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the first thing I wanted to say, Jonathan, is I think that local government has just played an absolute blinder in terms of what's happened so far in relation to rough sleeping in particular, for me anyway, as my interest in this. And like with many things in my life, in terms of working for government, that actually working in partnership, working through, working alongside colleagues in local government on the Troubled Families programme, on the antisocial behaviour one, and now back just looking at COVID-19 and rough sleeping, I think just the extraordinary work and commitment above and beyond anything that anybody could have rightly expected by many, many, many colleagues in local government has been quite extraordinary. And I do hope at some point in the future that can be truly recognised. I think it's no secret to colleagues on the call that I have often felt that the role of local government as a kind of the main player in any community for getting something done and knitting together our communities, I think it's a much misunderstood and undervalued part of the public sector, which meant that when austerity came, it was an easy target, really. Whereas actually cutting things like frontline police officers and frontline health workers is much more difficult for governments of any political persuasion to do. Whereas actually the people that take our bins away, the people that look after our old people, the people that protect our children, the people that actually have literally housed 15,000 people, not quite overnight, but not far off that in terms of the early work on COVID-19. That's all down to local government and local government officers, yes, working in partnership with others, but the leadership was important. So first stage was to essentially try and make sure we got everyone in. That was on the basis of advice from Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and more latterly with Jenny, his Oppo, and that they were really clear. I rang them on Friday night, right at the very beginning, and said, I'm kind of worried about communal night shelters for the spread. What about people on the streets? Like, where do we, how urgent? And he said really clearly, Louise, you've got to get them off the street. Not only are rough sleepers sort of aged beyond their age by an average of 10 to 15 years, they are older physically and mentally than the housed population, but also they are obviously so incredibly vulnerable with pre-existing conditions and things like drug, alcohol, and mental health. So job one was getting everyone in. I think that local government did it really effectively. I think that now job two, which people have already started, and now we've got the money to make sure people are able to get on and do this properly, is to make sure that we don't just use the next tranche of money that's come through, the 105. And this is where, though I can't back any specific scheme, and Phil and Maxine know that, nevertheless, the territory that this discussion is in is the right territory, which is how can we take the money that we've got and as best we can use that for the longer term solutions, so that we try and use this moment of crisis and turn it into something that has more longitude attached to it, so that, you know, there's a myriad of different ways. And actually I've already had 3 fantastic calls earlier today with colleagues in local government who are really trying to see not just kind of, okay, let's not lose people out of the hotels, but actually what type of provision do we think we need for the longer term, in order to make sure that, one, we decant any hotels effectively without people going back to the streets where that is possible. 2, that actually the numbers of people sleeping on the streets at the moment, and I'm touching wood, is the lowest it's been since 2010. And 3, how do we maintain that? So 2, how do we maintain that? And then 3, and Phil will know this is something I will say, is like, how do we make sure that whatever we do, we help the most vulnerable? And a sense really that out of that 15,000, we know that 5 to 7 were people that had a history of rough sleeping. Over 2 have been brought out of communal night shelters in London. And when I say communal night shelters, let's just be clear that what we've had in this country in recent years is nightly run by churches and community groups. 75% of the shelter provision is literally run by charities and voluntary organisations on a night by night basis, and 25% are also run by charities, mainly, as the guy told me, he called it the church group, his church shelter. 75% are nightly, 25% is over the course of a few weeks. Jonathan, I don't think we should go back to that, even if we weren't in COVID-19. COVID-19 means that we can't go back to that. It's quite tricky to see how you would organise that safely. There are ways that we could do it, but I don't want us to have to do it. I'd rather look at how we can, as the 3 local authorities I spoke to this morning are all trying to figure out how we actually manage stock and manage flow so that those numbers don't get back up. And I think we all need to be aware that when people talk about a second spike, I'm actually worried about a spike in homelessness and homeless families, which I know is not the subject of this conversation. I know it's not the subject of what I'm currently being tasked to look after for the government, but it is something that I personally worry about. So in a way, I want to deal with all the rough sleeping stuff, get it all sorted, and then sort of give ourselves some capacity to think about some of the other potential homelessness that will come out of the economic downturn. I mean, it could be that the Chancellor yesterday waved a magic wand that actually does protect us from some of that. I think it's too soon to tell. I'm not the Resolution Foundation. I'm not the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I wait to see what other experts think about what that may affect on our unemployment numbers. And as the unemployment numbers and working poor households start to lose one of the 3 jobs they're holding down, and they're already poor, I worry about what's going to happen to that. So I know that's not a discussion for today. but it's just in the back of my mind. One of the urgencies I feel is a need, you know, I've been frustrated that it's taken till today to actually get sign off from the powers that be in Whitehall to get the prospectus out to every local authority in the country, which it will now happen. It's been signed off this morning. But, you know, for me, we did the launch on the 24th of June. Now it's the 8th or 9th of July. That's a window I'd rather have not had. We've, you know, we need to get this out to colleagues in local government so they can get on with the business in hand. So just to give a sense of, I know the government will say 3.2 billion has gone into local authorities to deal with COVID. I'm very aware that most of that money will have gone into PPE and surviving, keeping local authorities afloat, and dealing with the specific COVID related for things like care homes. On the rough sleepers money though, it's not a bloody hell, it's not a terrible picture, because basically there was 112 million in the budget for this year anyway, which can be reconfigured. There's 160 million in the Move On Fund, which is a particular conversation here today. Thank you very much. Embarrassing. See, very strategic moment to get my swimming costume. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm hoping at some point I will go swimming, and I now need a larger costume. There we are, shared that with the nation. So 112 RSI, 160 in terms of the RSAP, or whatever their permanent programme is being called, which I think is what colleagues are interested in today. And then finally the 105 announced on the 24th of June, which is all revenue, which is essentially trying to say, how can we make sure that we, A, decant the hotels so people don't go back to the streets, and B, how do we make sure that essentially we try and hold the numbers of rough sleepers as low as we possibly can, I think, allowing people to have the breathing space to get through the autumn and into the new year. So that's essentially where we're at. And the reason for thanking the LGRU for doing this is because actually the more we are able to try and get longer term solutions out of this money, rather than giving it to Travelodge, which I'm happy to do in the short term, but in the longer term, I'd rather see that money go into a better place. And that prospectus will be out now tomorrow.
Thank you, Dame Louise. Thank you. Really, really great overview of the work that you're doing. And I think actually quite right to raise those longer term questions, because, you know, part of the problem, isn't it, is that we say, well, that's not the discussion for today, but we always need to make sure that what we're doing in the short term gives us a platform for those long term interventions, or at least doesn't close the door on them. I just wanted to pick up a couple of the questions that were submitted to us in advance and that are coming through on the chat. And I'll sort of put a couple of those in one go and then pass over to you, rather than having to sort of go backwards and forwards. You know, a lot of people asking about the extra funding. You know, there's a debate, obviously, as you would expect, about, is it enough? Will we get more? You know, but more people, actually, I think, interesting, asking about the timescale. So you've already answered that one of the questions that a lot of people were asking, which was when is the prospectus coming out? So tomorrow, we know that. But I wonder if you could say any more about the sort of timescales for that, and the sort of bidding process attached to that, and how you see it kind of stretching out over the next, you know, having got to this point, how you see it stretching out over the next few weeks and months.
So I think all the timescales will be in the prospectus that comes out tomorrow. But
Great.
I mean, I think the starting point is this, is that, okay, so COVID has given us this big job to do around actually literally thousands of people. And actually people have moved through those hotels as well. So it's not just the 15,000. I think there have been quite a few thousand people have already been moved on into the system, particularly where they've got a history of sleeping rough. But the reason I think that we can move pretty quickly on actually agreeing the money and getting it out the door over the summer is because actually a lot of people had good RSI plans already in place. And I think, you know, most of us know how to go and get permanent housing and with support. You know, there are properties out there, particularly outside London, that can be brought back into use pretty quickly. I think we're very clear that we want local authorities to be main place for those discussions, that it doesn't all have to go to residential social landlords, that we're looking at a great level of flexibility. I think people will be pleased with the level of flexibility, not tying the hands of colleagues in local government just to work with a certain grouping, but to actually be a bit broader. So it's not just RSLs, it could be other charities, or indeed money going into the local authority. I think the plan, if we could do this, and I think this is what colleagues in the department would ideally do, is in areas where there were anyway significant rough sleeping issues, they use this process that they call co-production. So basically they'll work with people to agree the best outcomes possible for, say, I don't know, 50 to 100 local authorities. Others, I think, where the numbers are small, really we should be talking about a prevention, and that they should just get some money to prevent homelessness in terms of rough sleeping. So I don't think the plan is to put everybody through a co-production process throughout the whole of the summer. I think the plan is to try and, talk to the areas that we feel might need an extra help. And I also think it's good to just remind people a call like this is very timely, because, I'm interested in are there things that people want to do that this money allows them to do, that if they didn't have this money, they wouldn't be able to do it. So this is the moment to think about assessment centres or pods, or, clever financing schemes and things like that. This is the time to think about that. And it'll be a balance between, like, everybody on the calls this morning were like, well, when's the bloody prospectus coming out, Louise? This has taken too long. We're ready to go. What's wrong with you? You're hopeless, MHCLG. We want the money. We want it now. We want to get on. With other people, that will just take longer. So if we can, we'll have all of this done by the end of the summer. I'd like a kind of plan in place that for everywhere by the end of the summer, the latest by the end of August. But I'm conscious people have had a rough few months, and not everybody will be able to meet that deadline, but if we can, that's what we do.
Yeah, and of course, absolutely, there are capacity issues within local government as well, in terms of people, with the best will in the world, people wanting to respond to this, but just being so stretched across so many fronts. And to be clear, is that, a couple of people are asking about, does that translate, as we move into a kind of recovery period, into a more kind of focus on prevention, into sort of longer term funding, so 3-5 year funding, so that people can really start to invest in longer term solutions? Well,
I mean, I think one of the things which I can't take any credit for at all was the February permanent, the 400 and, well, what was it then? It was 381 million announced in the budget for permanent move on with support. And I think that's one of the, since the clearinghouse 20 years ago, it's almost 20 years ago, there has been no significant investment in specifically rough sleeping accommodation with support. So I think I've been open about this, you guys know this as well, that if you want to get money, often you look at the money that's planned and bring it forward before you go and get new money. So the first job was to pull as much as that forward and then add to it with revenue. And I would be, that does go over there for a whole 3-year period. It's like that is planned, and that will go on. I mean, I think that this amount of money being spent on rough sleeping right now is quite a lot. And I think if you compared it to programs like the Troubled Families Programme, or perhaps even homeless families, I think one has to start to look at how proportionate it is to keep ploughing and ploughing and ploughing year in, year out, money into rough sleeping in a one-off way. I don't think that's a good way of dealing with public finances, and I think it's quite difficult for local authorities to plan beyond. And there are big gaps here. Like, I turned around at the beginning of this and said, well, great, this is a moment to get some people in who otherwise wouldn't come in, into treatment and recovery. Yeah. And was told very, very clearly, this was by colleagues in London, and I don't think it would be that different outside, that within the M25, there are no detox beds at all for anyone, let alone whether you're homeless. So there are some big building blocks that have gone since my day as the rough sleepers are, a long, long time ago, under that Labour era of that time. 20 years later, I think we need to build some of those blocks back in. And I think the spending review, which we assume will be this autumn, will be another chance to make sure that we go for another 3-year process. We know we'll need more rough, the department knows it will need more rough sleeping money. I just want to build it into a longer term project.
Yeah. Although spending reviews have become somewhat less predictable in recent years than we've been used to, but I mean, and I should say a lot of people on the chat, you're making a couple of points just to sort of, people saying, look, absolutely this money has been helpful. So acknowledgement that this has really helped people, and everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people saying, yeah, exactly your point. That money was helpful, but we need to shift to we need to shift upstream and look at more preventative approaches, because we don't want to be in a position where rough sleeping is what we're tackling. We want to be in a position where homelessness is what we're tackling. One very practical question, and I don't, which you may or may not be able to answer. Someone asking in terms of the prospectus and this money, how is that going to work? If people put bids in and those bids are sort of, will they receive that straight away, or is there a lead in time or a closing time? Does it have to wait till everyone's bids are in, or is it a rolling process?
I don't know the answer to
Okay.
that question, Jonathan. I probably should have found out the answer to that question before joining this call. But my understanding is that basically we want everything tied up by the end of the summer.
So it's
And
happening
we'll
at
go
speed.
for, like, the 3 local authorities I was on the call with this morning, the prospectus is out tomorrow. We'll do the deal, they'll get the money, and we press on. It's like, it's working at the timetable that suits. There's a bit of give and take, I think, around the timetable to co-produce. Co-production, though, on the other hand, doesn't have to mean slow production.
Sure. No, I think that does answer the question. I think that's absolutely. A couple of sort of slightly separate, or not separate, but slightly different issues that came up in the questions people submitted in advance. So a lot of questions about kind of information and information flow. So a councillor from a coastal region saying, look, one of the challenges we have is people get placed here because we have a lot of hotels and guest houses, but we don't always get the notification we need. We're not, we don't always know that they're coming, so we haven't had time to get the support services around them. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can improve, improving, we need money to do stuff, great, but we need other things. And any thoughts on how we as a sector can improve our communication with each other, how we can improve the communication with the government, so that we can start to close some of those feedback loops around where people are being placed in the country?
So, I mean, that's not necessarily a COVID issue, is it?
No.
That's the year in, year out, why are we never told these things are happening? And I don't have the solution to that. I mean, my view would be it couldn't be easier in some ways. Just pick up the phone and ring your oppo in the local authority that you'll send people to, because the fear of knowing that you're sending them out of borough often means people aren't prepared to make those calls because they don't want the flack. So that's part of it's a bit like, talking to the prisons minister about her wanting everybody to be accepted as homeless, and talking to the housing minister that he thinks everybody in prison should be housed by the prison. And you get in the middle of those things and actually just need to find some common sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not doing the review at the moment, Jonathan. I've literally come in to help try and galvanise action within the department and keep the speed up, and to get these plans out. It may be, and I think it's likely, that they'll want me to look at kind of rough sleeping and its causes afterwards. There are some big ticket items I think we haven't got to. For example, people with no recourse to public funds, elephant in the room when it comes to homelessness policy. I think that needs to be, that's not something you can unpack and look at and explain on the hoof. I think there's the issue about daytime street begging and street culture, which we all automatically assume is a rough sleeping issue as opposed to a drugs issue. When I finished off on troubled families, I was utterly convinced that we should do a troubled individuals program. The 27 people that have gone back to the street in the city I was talking to this morning have all been made really, really reasonable and appropriate offers, but they're there because they have a drug habit and there's a street culture and a drugs ring around them, and one is very well looked after by the public that think he's a rough sleeper, and he is a rough sleeper, but actually he's kept in rough sleeping by his drug addiction. And I think these are some big issues that I thought needed to be looked at before COVID happened, and I don't think they've gone away.
No, quite. And you know, one of the challenges with these discussions is always trying to keep within the remit that you currently have, which is challenging because, of course, all these things connect. And as you say, some of them predate COVID, some of them, a lot of them will be in place after COVID, and these threads run through it. I mean, you won't be surprised to learn that a lot of people ask those questions around, you know, people with no recourse to public funds. You know, what do we do around that? You know, how, as you say, one of the elephants in the room in homelessness policy, you know, because they fall through the cracks in all sorts of ways. One question we did get, which I think is partly, you know, does relate to the immediate COVID period, is that actually we've been able to, you know, make a lot of health gains for a lot of people, because you know, people who have been rough sleeping, but we've been, you know, because we brought them into hotels, whatever, we've been able to bring health services to them. A counsellor from a Met City has talking about, look, you know, we've got these people registered with GPs for the first time ever. We've got, you know, their consent to hepatitis C testing, treatment, reductions in alcohol dependency, uptake in prescriptions, whatever it may be. You know, we suddenly had this opportunity to work much more intensively with this group of vulnerable people and do much more for them. And we're really worried about losing that as we move back to something more, normal is not the right word, but as we move back to something that's more recognizable with what went before. Any thoughts on how do we lock in those gains, do you think?
So I think what's very interesting about the COVID-19 aspect of this is that because it was a pandemic and a virus, health people were right at the front of it. I mean, literally in the daily press conferences, flanked either side with a scientist and a doctor, and that obviously keeping people safe and keeping people alive due to COVID meant that we've had so many more conversations, work, action, joint action, assessment. It's been so much more hands-on from health than any time in my career. I would always say that one of the toughest Whitehall departments to get cooperation from was the Department of Health. On nearly every single Zardom or coordinator or job that I've had, it's been the toughest department, and that goes right up to the very end of my 20 years in Whitehall. And that's not to say that some of the ministers and civil servants aren't great people. It's not a criticism of ministers over those 20 years or civil servants, but there's something about penetrating the Department for Hospitals. I mean, I tease Simon Stevens that the NHS to me is the National Hospital Service. And I think what's been really, really upside of the pandemic on this area of the world is that we've had people in fixed locations, which makes running health into them much easier. Health can't really cope with people moving around the whole time and people not being, you know, turning up. I mean, I don't like going to bloody doctor. I have to go and see them every so often, and I resist going for my checkup endlessly. And I've got endless bloody mobile phones, a car, a house, and I hope I function pretty well most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. If you're homeless, you know, you're no different to me. And yet we expect people to turn up at 11:30 between, you know, come and do your blood test between 8:30 and 10, then we're closed for 2 hours at lunchtime, and then blah, blah, blah. 72% of the people in the Bournemouth hotels have got hepatitis C. So, you know, we've got to, I think one of the things coming out of this is, why don't we think of the rough sleeping end of homelessness being a public health issue and not just a homelessness issue? That actually the solution to an awful lot of rough sleeping is much more about their health needs, that they end up homeless because of their health needs, or their health needs exacerbate the longer they're homeless. So, sorry, the answer to your question is, it will get more difficult as the pandemic lifts and the NHS goes back to how it was before, which is they retreat back to their clinics and they retreat back, and that homelessness services are special GPs. So I could probably name most of the GPs that run specialist homelessness services in the country. There's that few of them. You know, there's the great guy in Oldham, there's another one in Manchester, there's, God love her, Dr. Hickey is still going down in Westminster. She could have a free TV license, frankly. You know, she's wonderful. But it's, and then it's this sense really that the health sector is doing us a favor when they come into the world of homelessness, as opposed to we are their complex needs, frequent flyer, very sick people. That's what rough sleepers are.
And I mean, I guess your answer to this will be both, but is that a structural problem or a cultural problem? Because when you put it like that, it sounds so obvious that yes, of course. So why don't we?
But I talked to the fantastic woman that is doing the drugs review at the moment, and is doing, I think, out of Department of Health, and it's like, so we all think it's a public health crisis if you die of a virus. We don't think it's a public health crisis if you're dying young on the street.
Yeah,
I think it is a public health crisis. And I think if we saw it in that way, we would get both the cultural and the systemic change. But this kind of, even care homes, I'm straying right off my turf, but our treatment of the elderly, by the way that we have gone about social care, just operationally, who is actually responsible for these odd 50-minute interviews that we send people in to do? Not interviews, but care. It's such a mess, all of it. And we've got to sort this stuff out coming out of COVID-19. In the meantime, it would be great if we got lots of housing coming out of COVID-19, and that was, instead of spending money on lots of hotels, we spent money on maxing out whatever we can, doubling the money that we've got. I've got Nat Sloan's lot, the social capital people, really keen to see if they can, gross up the amount of money to add more units to it. So going full circle back, that's what we've got to concentrate on.
And of course, Phil will touch on some of that in a moment. Just one point coming through on the Q&A, just to add to that, is mental health and mental health service provision is a particular gap often within that scenario that you described.
It's three, isn't it? It's drugs, alcohol, and mental health. I remember first time round back in 1999, I was fresh out of shelter, and I used to say the solution to rough sleeping is neither cheap, easy, or basic, and it's more than a cup of soup. And that remains, we've now had, since latter end of Labour and since 2010 onwards, we've really had a neglect of the population of people in and around the streets. So what you've now got, which is in a way much more worrying than the overall figures, is within that population of 5,000, say, in England a year, within that you have a very, very significant cohort that have drug, alcohol, and mental health problems, one of the three, two of the three, of all of the three. And that the solution to that isn't straightforward. And we've meanwhile, obviously because of austerity, loads of local authorities had to decommission, cut, and do away with a lot of what would now be seen, I quote, as expensive. So the other thing just to mention whilst I've got it is, I think this fixed population thing is a really interesting thing. So the fact that we've had large numbers of people in fixed locations makes it much easier for the health service and other systems to grab people. And I think one of the things that happened over the last decade plus is that we've hollowed out some of that interim provision. So we all love Housing First. I happen to think Housing First is a much used expression that actually shouldn't be used quite the way that it is. I think housing with support, not everybody needs £12,000 a year per capita cost on Housing First. It has its place, but actually there's an awful lot of people that don't need £12,000 a year revenue spending on them in terms of support structures. That's practically like ITU levels, frankly. So housing with support, you can manage much greater caseloads. I'm not paid to tell people not to spend money. I just think we don't have a lot of money. If Labour was in power, the Tories were in power, it doesn't matter to me, but we ought to get that one right. And so I think we've hollowed out, though, some of the immediate options for people, immediate options for people coming off the street. So we closed a lot of the direct access and have gone down a route of street to Housing First. And I don't want to go back to a day that you had to go here, then go here, and then go here, then go here. But I think we've slightly over hollowed out easy options for people before they hit the street.
So again, it comes back to those points around integration and making it easy for people to access the support they need. I'm very conscious of your time. And look, I don't think it's a controversial political point. Say if the money that we do spend, we should spend as effectively as possible.
Exactly.
Just to not to pose these as questions, but just to sort of reflect some of the other things that people have been asking about. I think it's interesting that people are making points more about the kind of the predictability of money than the quantum of it and the sort of visibility of it going forward. But we've already touched on that. A lot of people, and this is outside the remit of your current task group, but a lot of people talking about the private rental sector and local housing allowance and the role of all that in fixing problems. And someone on the Q&A from a sort of smallish borough council saying, look, we don't have that many homeless people compared to a lot of other places, but of course they have all the same problems, and they're just as much people as they are in bigger places, and relatively small amounts of money. But again, that sort of visibility and predictability. Yeah. I know you have to get off, so I was just wondering if in closing, just any final thought just on what your sort of key message to local government is.
Well, my first thing is just a massive thank you for everything that colleagues in local government have done so far. I think that we do have a moment right now in this generation to essentially have a really good shot at making sure the numbers of people on the streets does not go back up. I'd be really disappointed if all of this money and all of this effort meant that we were having long-term vulnerable people returning to the streets in great numbers. That would be a great disappointment. And I think in amongst things like the flow of people to the street, setting up new provision, reorganising RSI, not, Jonathan, to lose sight of going for the most vulnerable, going for the hardest to help, not the easiest to help, being I think the gift of this particular moment is there is enough money to go for the people that need the most help, and also to be experimental with some of the money that's available, that there's money to experiment here. Which, and again, that would be great. I mean, I'm very interested in complex needs individuals, very interested in different models of assessment. You see the way some of these hotels have been used as assessment centres, quick throughput assessment centres, and local colleagues around the country have already been talking to me and to us about these sorts of things. I just want to make sure we get them the money so they can crack on with it.
Absolutely, and that point about innovation, crucial. We talk to so many councils at the moment who really recognise that neutral is not an option at the moment. You can't stand still. We are going to have to change how we do things, and we have to move forward. Dame Louise, that was an amazing sort of overview of what you're doing now. We're incredibly grateful. The oddity of these online meetings is that we don't close with, you can't do a round of applause or the normal kind of closing. So I'm afraid it's just a fairly brutal goodbye and cut you off, but we are very grateful. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And I should reassure people, of course, that we will be taking all of your questions. We will, and the points that people have made. A lot of people making those points about it's not just about the amount of money; it's about the predictability of it, the time frames over which it happens. Breaking out of a kind of annual sort of spot funding bidding process and trying to get some predictability. And we will certainly be. We will make sure that Louise's office gets all of those points going forward. But she talked a lot, though, about, one of the things she touched upon very importantly was, none of this, somewhere in all of this picture, if we want to reduce homelessness, we need more homes. And we need ways of financing, building, acquiring, putting into play more properties, more housing. So we're going to hear a little bit now about one of the initiatives that's out there seeking to do that. We're going to hear from Phil Willis and from Maxine Moore about the 2020 initiative. Phil Willis will be familiar to many of you as a former MP, a Minister of State for local government, in which role he oversaw the £2 billion Supporting People strategy, which did an awful lot to eradicate rough sleeping. And he now runs Wellington Street Partners Limited, a tripartite political risk analysis. and is working on as an advisor and local government contact for the 2020 initiative, which you will hear about. He will tell us about in a second. Maxine Moore is also an advisor to the 2020 initiative and has worked with various ministers and Home Secretaries over the years, and her role is to support partnerships with local authorities and to work more effectively, help them work more effectively with vulnerable people. So Phil is going to give us a sort of overview. There is a presentation which my colleague Barry will bring up in a second. But before he does that, Phil, do you want to just sort of give people an intro and then go into telling us about the 2020 initiative?
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Can you hear me now? So thank you very much to the LGIU for hosting this really important subject today, and to Louise Casey, who is as ever is there at the forefront with her forceful personality and clear analysis. The 2020 initiative is an attempt to bring long-term financial solutions to the problem of rough sleeping and to address the prevention of rough sleeping. We are a housing first initiative, although following Louisa's advice, I think we're going to move towards a housing with support initiative. That better sums up what we're doing. So probably if we can bring the presentation up, I'll just take people through it as quickly as I can, and we will answer questions on it. So what we essentially do is buy homes. We buy flats, we buy houses, and we will buy halfway interim accommodation should our local authority partners advise that. The essential point to understand about 2020 is that we buy the houses and the local authority nominates the tenants. And the support care is provided by the third sector partners, social renters, or the local authority, or in most cases, a combination of both. Why 2020? Pretty corny name, to be honest, Jonathan. We planned it a year last February, a year before we knew what COVID was. And the idea is simply to get 2,020 people in homes during the year 2020. So we can make a big contribution to the problem, to solving the problem. We have a ring-fenced fund of £236 million. That money is from the United Kingdom, it is from occupational pension funds, and it is long-term money, and by long-term we mean a 25-year term. We deliver our mandate from the investment funds by buying houses and flats, and then working with councils and the third sector to provide the care. The homes that we purchase, we do so in partnership with the local authorities. So we don't just provide a portfolio of homes in areas that perhaps you wouldn't want. We set out last year with our initiative and did 2 pilot schemes, one in Merseyside and one in the West Midlands. Just moving on now to explain how that works. So the figure of 236 million came about because of, well, essentially because of Louise. We had been allocated 140 million at the start of the year, but because when the crisis happened, we realized we could make a contribution, we were able to convince the investors to increase that amount of money. The financial model is proving itself, which means that we will be able to replicate this in the future with more money. The essential point to understand on the financing is that because it is long-term money, the return on the investment is at a very low interest rate, And because the local housing allowance is sustainable and sovereign, the rents that we're able to charge are LHA rates. I'll come on to how the wraparound care works at the moment. So just to re-emphasize the policy goal, we do work with government, although obviously we are politically neutral. Our fund is covered by the Finance Conduct Authority. We have to abide obviously by the regulations, and we're very sensitive to the legal and statutory requirements that councils have. So the funding, the new government funding, will bring suitable housing forward by acquiring new units, refurbishing existing accommodation units, and leasing private rented sector properties, specifically for those who are rough sleepers or at risk of rough sleeping. All of our properties fit into that category, apart from that we don't rent any properties, we own them. And we buy them and then enter into lease arrangements with the council or our charity partners. So that's just to say we are in line with government's initiative. Quickly, just to go through the pilots, and we have the documentation to show you how these worked. 2 pilots, one in Merseyside. The Big Help is a 12-year-old charity based in Knowsley. They started as providing food banks, and developed into providing housing first and wraparound care. Their primary target has been people coming out of prison or through the probation service. The second one has been in the West Midlands, in Birmingham and Sandwell. The Lotus Sanctuary provides support particularly for victims of domestic violence and their children. Obviously a very sensitive area. We have, these were carried out last year. The pilots have been proved to be successful in terms of improving the tenants' lives. We measured that by, in the Merseyside case, the reduction in reoffending, and that benefits the clients and the community. So we are trying to break that vicious circle that Louise talked about, whereby not everybody wants an ex-rough sleeper in their neighbourhood, but people do want to see an end to rough sleeping. So we have to prove that we have a long-term strategy. The scheme provides a new revenue for the social renter and or the charity and or the provider of services. That is because the rate of return on our investment is covered by the local housing allowance. We offer a fuller repair insurance lease, and we ask the councils to enter into a nominations agreement. For the people we service, the welfare benefits that they receive in addition to the local housing allowance provide the resources for the wraparound care. So the final point is the wraparound service is self-sufficient. Thanks, Barry. The next slide shows the people who we can help. Essentially, the people we can help are people who qualify for housing-related support benefits, so that the revenue streams are there to provide the care. You'll be familiar with the people we're talking about. A lot of the programs we've done already cover them. We make specific provision where youngsters are involved because of the extra statutory duties. We're very conscious of that. But our mandate is to provide care for the people who benefit from or are eligible for housing related support, what used to be known as supporting people in my day when we did have the funds to address this. Okay, so just moving on to the next point. We launched the scheme in January of this year, and then the COVID crisis came along, and we realized that we needed to step up to the mark. So we got together with Louise and the Rough Sleeping Initiative. We consulted with Crisis and Shelter in particular. I'm very grateful for their advice. Don Sparks in particular, who seems to know more about this than anyone. So we have invited all of the relevant local authorities, and really all authorities are relevant because, of course, upper tier authorities can help provide with the wraparound care where you have a two-tier area. The change we made as a result of the crisis was that we realized that local authorities would be asking for interim accommodation. The point that Louise was making, that you can, if somebody's in a fixed location, you can help them, get them on their feet, provide the medical and other support, mental health support that you need. But we then move those people into our houses, or they can go straight into the houses. And we provide those houses indefinitely. As long as the local authority says we want these people to live here, they can stay there, subject to obviously the common sense requirements. In the Merseyside pilot, we only had a 2% failure rate of people who just couldn't cope with living in their own homes. So that's the purpose. We, just to reiterate, 236 million people available. We're talking to 17 local authorities across the country at the moment. We'd like to hear from more. The contact details are available on our website, 2020 initiative, and we've set ourselves Jonathan, it reminds me of the Blue Peter target days for those of us who are old enough to remember. We've got to get to 2020 by December the 31st. So we make that information publicly available. We have obviously a backup team to help us and to help get these schemes over the line. And basically, Jonathan, that's the contribution that we think we can make. I'll perhaps talk about the finances and the partnerships with Maxine in the next session, but that's the bare bones of the 2020 initiative.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. So I know that Phil is very happy to take questions. So do put questions into the Q&A feature, and I will open that up so that everyone can see the questions that are being asked. First things first, Phil, just a question came through on the chat while you were talking. Natalie McVeigh is a councillor portfolio holder for housing and health in a rural district council. Will your project extend to communities such as mine? So is this open to every type of council in every part of the country?
Yes, it is, Natalie. We find that it's different in two-tier areas, and it's different in combined authority areas where we need to put partnerships into place, obviously. But no, our scheme works just to be a cold-hearted finance person, Jonathan, because
we need that.
Well, the money we're spending is pensioners' money. We're not a profit organisation. We have to deliver for the pensioners, so we have to be hard-headed. Wherever the local housing allowance and the additional housing-related benefits work, the scheme works. The critical point, Natalie, is that the cost of the house is not really relevant to us. We get the return on the investment over the 25-year term, and it is the rental stream that provides that return on investment. The asset, the actual house, at 25 years, goes to the council. We literally give the house to the council at 25 years, which means that treasurers and cabinet members for finance like the scheme because there is an asset then on the balance sheet. But if the value of the house goes up, then that asset value belongs to the council. If that sounds too good to be true, just think about the fact that we're looking at a 25-year period. We buy the house, we pay the money back, just like a mortgage. So as long as the LHA covers that money, it works. In terms of the partnerships, Maxine will talk more about those. The partnership, the wraparound care can be provided by the local authority, it can be provided by charities, or it can be preferably be provided by both. The partners that we have will reach out to all areas of the country, but we will work with the local authority to identify who the best partners are. So I hope that answers the question that Natalie's asked.
Okay, I'll come back to people and check whether in a second and check whether they have follow-up questions. Paul Sylvester, is the local authority expected to underwrite returns, for example, if LHA reduces or freezes? For example, if LHA reduces or is frozen?
That's the critical question, and the answer broadly, with some exceptions, is yes. So what is the financial risk to the council of this scheme? So on the positive side, there is the transfer of the asset at the 25 years. There is also the saving to the temporary accommodation budget that is made. And in my experience, that is about a 4-to-1 ratio. So that is very significant. And I personally get very frustrated where we don't look at the financial package in the round holistically, as I think we say. So what is the financial risk to the council? The financial risk is if there is a void, if there isn't a tenant paying rent in the house, and obviously we enter into a service level agreement as part of the package to make sure that we are incentivized to provide repairs, maintenance, good quality housing. But to answer the question directly, should local housing allowance be abolished, then we would have to renegotiate the terms. Were it to be frozen, it would depend on the circumstances in each area, and that would depend upon the formula between cost of house purchase, return on investment, and LHA level. So it isn't a guarantee. I don't want to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, but the balance is hugely in favour of the local authority in that there is the minimal risk. We also, I should say, I'm not allowed. I don't write this down because I don't want to give all the people's money away. But we do, Jonathan, have the flexibility to absorb some debt if a tenant comes to us with some previous problems, or the council tenant has got some debt. So we are, because we're 25 years, we are able to absorb some of that.
Okay. So, and I think that's important to be clear then. So, the balance of probability is in favour of the council financially, but it's not, there is a risk, but yeah, the balance of risk is in the council's favour. Just to come back to Natalie's point, because she says you did answer her question, but just a quick supplementary. The council where she's a councillor doesn't currently have housing stock. Does that matter?
On the contrary, we will buy the houses for you.
Right. Okay. Clear answer. Another question from Hannah McSherry. Is this funded? She's interested in what, the sustainability of support for this. Is this being funded through intensive housing management schemes that allow the provider to draw down enhanced housing benefit?
It can be, but it's not dependent upon that.
Okay. Great. You'll be pleased to know, Phil, that Natalie's even happier with who would cover damage to the property?
So in terms of the damage, we do have a standard FRI lease, and this is the most difficult area for us because we negotiate on a bespoke basis with each council that we talk to. So if we enter into a nominations agreement, we would expect that we would make sure that the fabric of the building was sound, and the local authority would be responsible for maintenance. But where there is damage concerned, we would take on that responsibility. The reason why I hesitate is not that I'm trying to hide anything. It's simply that in different local authority areas, we have different arrangements. Sometimes it's through a housing association, and the maintenance and repair would be done on a contract with them, and we negotiate with the council on who that is. Most commonly, the council wants to nominate, but the upside is that as long as we get the percentage return on the pension fund investment, everything above that is for the council to play with. So that gives you, in most cases, I've only come across 2 cases where that hasn't worked, and we're having to negotiate a different management arrangement.
Okay, so that's important. So individual bespoke agreements with each council that you work with.
Yeah, it's so. I mean, it's in the West Lancashire area where we. It's actually 2 councils. One of them doesn't have any stock, so they don't have their own in-house, and the other one doesn't have much rough sleeping. So we negotiate bespoke.
Okay, and there was a point there about sort of partnerships with housing associations and others. I'll come to Maxine in a minute to ask her to say a little bit more about, because obviously councils don't operate as kind of as islands in this area. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a sec. But before we do that, just a couple more quite specific questions. Tracy Brushett is asking, should the tenant enter the workforce and no longer qualify for the housing elements of universal credit, does the rent level remain at LHA?
Yes.
Right. Okay, that's very clear. And Keristine is asking, do you purchase HMOs or shared accommodation as well as self-contained accommodation?
Just to amplify to Tracy, just to emphasize this point, we are not making a profit. We pay the return on the investment. As long as the interest is paid, we don't care what the rent above that is. It's a bit like a mortgage. I've got a mortgage. I have to pay my money each month for my mortgage. If my salary triples, I still have to pay that. So it's the same. If the person gets a job, the rent is still the LHA. And that allows us to give that permanence, that security. So we're not moving people in and out of different houses, in and out of different flats. So it lays out a pathway so that the wraparound support can genuinely say to these people, get your life back in order, we'll help you, and you can stay in this house as long as you want. So that's the answer to that. And Jonathan, in my passion to answer that, I've forgotten the second question.
The second question, no, that's fine. The second question was about whether you purchase HMOs or shared accommodation as well as self-contained accommodation.
Yes, we do now. When we started last year, we concentrated on just doing individual homes. We have a preference for a minimum of 2 bedrooms. We don't like 1 bedroom, but I qualify that by saying that is not our decision. The policy is down to the local authority and the partners. We realized as we moved out of the pilot into the full implementation that authorities really did want some interim places where you could put groups of people together. And really the point Louise made reinforces this. So for example, in one town in Yorkshire, we bought an accommodation block. It's actually an old care home. It has 42 bedrooms. And people go into there for about 6 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, and then we move them into the houses. So it gives the partners the chance to help people get their lives on track. A lot of the people, you wouldn't put them straight into a house, I don't think. I'm not the expert. But, so yes is the answer to that.
Okay, and a question from Councillor Smith, sort of that follows on from that quite neatly, I think. What type of properties are preferred? Older ones, new builds, modular? Is there a preference for type of property?
Just to emphasise, the council decides that. We look at what's available, either on the market, most often off market, because we have financial muscle. we can get off-market homes, but we buy the houses that the council wants. If we do have surplus portfolio, we will not evict people, but we may have surplus portfolio that's not within the council's remit. But we will discuss with the council. We have a staff member who specialises in conveyancing, and she will talk to the council about which homes on the list available the council wants us to buy on their behalf. Okay. Remember, it's not the value of the house that matters to us, it's the rental income.
Right, because the value of the house is the council keeps the house at the end, so that's of no county. Right. I will bring Maxine in 1 second. I've just got a couple of other questions, just practical questions. Maintenance costs, management and disrepair issues. Who's responsible for those? The local authority or 2020?
The answer is that we offer a fully repairing lease. We look after the fabric. The council looks after the maintenance. We look after the damage. But we do have a bespoke negotiation depending on the financial arrangements in each area. Okay.
What about if rent arrears accrue? Who's responsible for those? The council, I think.
If the tenant at that stage is a housing benefit tenant, then that's the point that the finance questioner asked before.
Yeah.
That's the risk.
That's the risk that sits with the council.
And that's what you've got to count against the costs of not doing this. So that's a fair point.
Okay, that's. I mean, we've touched on that twice, but I think that is really important to be clear about, so that people can see which bit of risk sits with the local authority and what's the potential benefit, both financially and in terms of providing housing. Is there a limit to how many homes you can buy in a given local authority?
The only limit is what's available.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Can't buy houses that don't exist. Okay. We're getting a lot of questions, but this is maybe a good point to bring Maxine in. Maxine, you work on the sort of partnership aspect of this, helping local authorities to engage better with partners and managing some of their relationships with vulnerable groups. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Because obviously in a lot of places, local authorities are just one part of a fairly complex housing ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when we look at this kind of project work, we see the local authority as the conduit that's going to be bringing everybody together. And a lot of conversations start off about the council and the rough sleepers and never think about all of the other projects that are around the edges. And I think, as with anything, the role that I play is that if local authorities want me to come in and support, and that might be to facilitate meetings, to do audits, to have a look at what partners there are, how we can best use them, even things like looking at case management systems that might make it easier in the long run to have the vulnerable person and the case management system to know who exactly is responsible for looking after the well-being of that person, that they're making sure that they are working to the needs of that particular housing authority. So the partnership side takes, I think, a lot of different faces. But as Louise said before, she wants to see people thinking clever and outside of the box. And I think that's where the partners come into this, because if we look at the main problem we have from partners, they very often say that they work with rough sleepers on the streets. We mention houses, they couldn't afford houses, they don't have the properties to work with the rough sleepers. So this is really about councils looking at what resources are available to them in a pot and creating this better jigsaw of putting people where they needed to work together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's where I come in.
Okay, that's really helpful. So again, I think that's important, just to stress the point that there is sort of facility within an interaction with 2020 to kind of manage some of those broader relationships. It's not just for the council doesn't have to do that by itself. Look, I want to. I'm conscious of time. We've got 15 minutes left, and the one thing, my one skill in life is closing meetings on time. So I want to open it up, everyone, to a slightly broader conversation. So do feel free to, please ask any more questions in the Q&A box. But also, it'd be good to capture some of your views on either on the 2020 initiative, but also I think just more generally on, what are the key things we need to do moving forward. You all talked, or a lot of you talked when we had Dame Louise with us around, the necessity not just for more money, though several of you made the point that more money would be nice, but also more visibility of the money over longer time frames. So that's, we captured that. What else needs to happen if we're to really put an end to rough sleeping, and if we're to make that sort of transition that Louise Casey talked about, and that Phil and Maxine are talking about, of shifting from just focusing on the sort of the really acute end of the system to preventing homelessness in total. It's something we've done a lot of work on at LTIU. We know there are issues around the private rental sector. We know there are in the type of tenancies offered. We know there are issues, and Phil's initiative speaks to some of that. We know there are issues around sharing of data. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There are all sorts of things that sort of block progress on this. It'd be really interesting just to hear from people, and I'll just kind of reflect them back just on what you think the most important things are to shift this forward. But while we're waiting for that, Phil, I don't know if you can answer this question. I probably should have checked with you first. It may be sort of bound by sort of commercial issues, but could you tell us a little bit about which authorities you're working with, or if you can't say which, what type of authorities you're working with?
No problem at all. We obviously the Lotus Sanctuary work with Birmingham and Sandwell, and actually have a relationship within Solihull. We do have this issue, Jonathan, of which came up before, which is what if the tenant is from one local authority but is living in another local authority? Right. We find that some of the people we've talked to, particularly where there are hotspots, they don't want to be making the problem worse. So we are able to offer security that we won't put people in houses in the local authority area that are not part of the scheme. But we've got the West Midlands. We've got through the Big Help, we've got 2 districts in the home counties that we're talking to, and we are talking to 2 lower tier areas in Lancashire. We're talking to Greater Manchester Combined Authority. We're hoping we've just started the conversation with Merseyside, and also within the unitary boroughs within the combined authorities. And one conversation we're having, it's not a secret, it's my own area in Oldham. We're actually looking at general needs housing and whether or not we could provide some of the houses for that, whilst obviously focusing on the rough sleepers or the prevention of rough sleeping as the priority policy area. But you might have people on your housing waiting list who don't qualify for housing related support, but do need a house. So if we want to, we can have a conversation about that as well. So Northeast, we've got 5 unitaries. We're talking to West Yorkshire 2, Northwest 2 lower tier, and I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unitaries.
Okay.
So we tend to be Midlands and North, but we're not exclusive to that. So that's the spread.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's a national initiative.
Yeah, absolutely, it's a national thing. Yeah, it's very much a national thing, because from our point of view, proving the model across the country will allow us to perpetuate the scheme in the future, so that we can attract more pension fund investment to buy more houses, to get more people to prevent rough sleeping.
Yeah. And hopefully, doing something good for all our pension funds while we're at it.
Well, that's an important point. The schemes that we work with are occupational pension funds. At this point, none of them are local government pension funds, but I think it will take us 3 or 4 years to prove the model.
Sure.
to such an extent that we can roll it out. Our aim is 2,000 people. That sounds a lot. It's probably about a fifth of what Louise needs us to do. Louise needs to achieve. But moving forward, there's no reason why it shouldn't be, 4, 5, 6,000 houses.
Okay. It's fantastic. I'll come back to you both in a sec. I just want to reflect some of the points that are coming through about what it is we need. So moving slightly away from your initiative, just a more general kind of sector view on what it is we need to do. The point that was made earlier about access to health professionals and provision that can be easily accessed by rough sleepers has been made again, and doing that in places they feel comfortable attending. People understand what they're going through, a sort of one-stop shop. And Dame Louise made this point that it's no good. It's hard enough for any of us to access health services when you have to go to the right building, and then you go to a different building, and different systems. And these, I find these bewildering. So how we expect people in chaotic conditions to do it is a challenge. So we need to think about that. Councillor Wooding's making the point that we need to stem demand. Absolutely. So we need to get upstream of this. She's talking about having 85 households pending lifting of Section 21 eviction, trying to get ahead of this. More and more people being found sleeping in cars, for example, but also these information flows. So not always getting clear information about people who are being refused asylum, for example, and how, whether they're likely to be at risk of homelessness. Education. One of the points when Dame Louise was talking, I think, is there is something in this. I was thinking about that cultural sort of stuff about us not seeing it as a public health issue, and there is something that we all need to accept responsibility for in that. We all need to understand that homeless people are people who need support. However chaotic their lives may be, however as the person put on the chat, however nasty they may come across as being, they're not. It's not always pleasant. It's not always comfortable. But we need to understand why people are in those conditions and why they're behaving in the way they're behaving and why they have the problems they have, and responding to that. Question for 2020: is there going to be communication? Question. Sorry, this is a question. Sorry, I was thinking about 2020 as the date, and I think I know the answer to this question, but actually I'll come back to that. This is a specific question to you, Phil. A couple of other points. Really big challenge around operational teams within local authority and their capacity to provide sleepers to rough services. Years of cuts have left local authorities only as gatekeepers who are having to kind of triage the most priority needs. Somebody making the point that really we haven't improved this much over 20 years. Often RS will not require care, but rough sleepers won't require care, but may have substance and abuse and other health issues and may not wish to engage. So a similar point around wrapping that stuff around them, but also clear about which agency owns meeting those needs, where there are gaps in service provision. My colleague Andrew Walker making the point about our work with the Local Government Homelessness Commission last year. We really need a sort of prevention toolkit that uses data from across the public sector and that's designed around the needs of the sector, not just the type of data that Whitehall finds it easy to put out. So I think some really sort of practical and coherent points there around. Oh, there's loads more coming through suddenly. LHA. I mean, we know this is a problem. So someone's making the point that in their coastal district, it's relatively low compared to other areas. This is a question to you, Phil. Would that be a barrier?
No, the opposite.
Right. So
it's not a barrier. It's a function of the price of the house, the LHA, and the time period. So if you have a low LHA and a very high house price, it's difficult for us. It still works, but it's difficult. And we can't offer the range of homes that we would be able to otherwise. But if the LHA is low, it's a function of the house price, and it works over the 25 years.
I mean, it is one of the oddities in the system that when we did that work on homelessness last year, we had council leaders in the southeast saying, our LH, you just can't. It's not enough. You can't you can't rent property with that, and you had council leaders in the northwest saying it's too high, it's kind of subsidizing a really dysfunctional private rental sector, substandard housing, and we can't do much about it. And can't we have some of your, there isn't, there's a question about localizing LHA and how you decide that I think would be quite interesting.
As the minister, I tried to change the LHA formula to meet that point, because you had a particular you still have a particular problem with coastal towns, where you've got low LHAs, low rents, so you act as a honeypot for problems.
Yeah.
The way this scheme works, and frankly, the brilliance of it is that you because you're committing to the long term, your repayments. I mean, it's no secret our interest rates are below 3%. So it's not a development profit that we make. So for the people listening who have low LHAs, we very much would like to speak to you.
Right. That's really helpful. And that picks up just the final specific question to you, Phil, which I think I know the answer to, but just to be clear, because someone's asking the question, the question for you, is there communication with local authorities before purchasing properties in their locality?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're not going out and buying property and then pitching this to people. You're working with people before you do this.
That's right. To be very clear and honest, the fund does have property portfolio with existing tenants in it, and we don't evict people. But if some of those properties become available, we will offer them to the council. But the mainstream, the 98% of it, is to say to the council, these are the houses that we could buy. Would you like us to buy them?
Right. One other direct question to you that I said that was the last one, but one more's popped up, which is helpful. And is the 2020 initiative looking to secure more funding from pension funds to develop this project longer term?
Yes, we want to we want to prove the financial model. We want to show that the outcome for the tenants is good, as well as the outcome for the pension funds. It's quite difficult. I mean, some of the cases we've seen in the pilots, people, there's some pretty chaotic people, and they need help. And sometimes they need a bit of tough love as well. And the politics of it, I'm an ex-politician, so I think I'm allowed to make a political point, is that elected councillors have to say to the public, we're dealing with the rough sleeping, but we're also not moving people with chaotic lives into the house next door to you, because that's not a politically good thing to do as well. So you've got to get that right. And so we have to show that the system does, by having a permanent home, that we can get those people on the pathway back to a stable life. But the answer to your question is yes, we believe that levering, I call it private money, but it is pension fund money. It's really mutual money. By levering fairly significant sums, £250 million in the first year, we think with local authorities, we can provide as near as is possible to a permanent solution to rough sleeping, as near as is possible.
Fantastic.
Bearing in mind what Louise said.
And that's really interesting. One final question: what's not clear still is how the housing support to make the tenancies sustainable is to be funded. That's sort of out with your. So
that essentially the welfare benefit that the tenant is entitled to over and above the LHA level, because they are in the vulnerable group, pays for the wraparound care. Obviously, we have charities that support as well, but that's the essential answer to the question.
All right. I'm going to start winding up because we're coming up to time. Just to reflect one other point that a couple of people were making on the chat. There is this issue around, you mentioned it being a pilot, and it does, a couple of people have made this point, and I think it's absolutely right, that, one of the things we need to do as a sector is really think about how we build learning and capacity around the things that work. So we get lots of pilots, we get lots of pockets of really good practice. How do we aggregate all of those and turn them into a national strategy? I think that is a really important point, and that's not a question to you, Phil, because you're doing your thing, and your thing is part of that. But I think it's really interesting to think about how 2020 initiative can be forms part of that suite of kind of ideas and initiatives and things that move us forward on this.
And I just said there that I think that social media is a great way that anybody who's part of this 2020 initiative via social media, we can start to collate good practice, what works, what doesn't work.
Absolutely. And then I'm just about come to you and Phil for final points. I think that's really important. I just want to say to people that obviously we will, if you do have any further questions, please get in touch, and we can pass them on to Phil and Maxine, and they'll be very happy to answer them even after the event, obviously. And anyone, a couple of people have asked if we can connect you to talk to them, and of course we can do that. That is what we'll do. So first Maxine, and then Phil, just sort of final thoughts about what we've heard today, and what key takeaways you'd like people to leave with. Maxine first.
Well, really, I think the thing I would like people to think about is that through the COVID crisis, we've got people off the street, so it is possible to do. To have a look at what good practice has come out of that, to look at the individuals and the learning that we found. I mean, Louise touched briefly about people on the streets wanting to be there, and I always feel that you get rough sleepers who develop a community within the street, which is hard to break that cycle. So really practice around how do we deal with the individual, being an individual, but also to just think outside the box about how we can use funding and partnerships and communities to develop something collectively that starts to address this issue via having a house from 2020.
Fantastic. Phil, last word.
No solution is risk-free. There isn't a solution that's risk-free, but the temporary accommodation budgets that fall on councils are appalling, and they're appalling for the tenant, and they're appalling for the taxpayer. And these types of solutions that we're talking about are financially better for all parties. Final point, I'd like to thank the LGIU. I'm old enough to remember when you were formed, Jonathan, in 1983 with Dennis. And LGIU have provided this facility today. It's very tough for councils at the moment, tougher than it's ever been. But that means we need to come together more through organisations like LGIU, who have not charged for this, and that's terrific. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Phil. That's very kind of you. I mean, look, our job is to connect councils with interesting ideas, and I think today's been a great example of that. Really interesting to hear about the 2020 initiative. A thing that can help. And people can take that up with you separately, and also interesting to hear from Dame Louise Casey about the work that she's leading. Lots of support for that from the attendants. Some questions about it. Always questions about, will the money be enough? Will it be predictable enough? How's it really going to work? As we would expect, local government needs to speak about these things, to argue its case, and to put its best foot forward. That's it. We're out of time. I've overrun by a minute. So I'm going to close it. One of the awkwardnesses, I think, of online meetings, which are great because so many people can attend, but they have awkward goodbyes because it's not like being in a room. So I'm just going to say thank you, everybody. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Maxine. Thank you to Dame Louise Casey. Thank you to all of you for coming, and for the team at LJU for putting it on. And goodbye.
Goodbye.